your car has been recalled, just write down your VIN number and go to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's webpage. That's nhtsa.gov/recalls.
The Me Too movement has reverberated throughout our culture, in Hollywood, Capitol Hill, through newsrooms and boardrooms, on factory floors, and in houses of worship. NPR's Tom Gelton looks at how evangelical Christians are distinguishing sexual sin from sexual crime.
In Tennessee earlier this month, a young pastor named Andy Savage stood before his congregation and emotionally confessed to what he called a sexual incident years earlier with a 17-year-old girl. Savage said he had repented before God back then, and then he said this:
"For any painful memories or fresh wounds this has created for anyone, I am sorry, and I humbly ask for your forgiveness. I love you all very much."
A clip of that moment is getting a lot of attention in evangelical circles, less having to do with the pastor's confession than with the congregation's response. They gave him a standing ovation. Some evangelical women see in that reaction a tendency in their faith culture to celebrate people just for tearfully confessing their sins, no matter if they've been held accountable.
Christians love a redemption story.
Caitlin Beatty is an editor-at-large for the magazine Christianity Today.
That really gets to the heart of what Christians believe, that God can redeem the most broken of people, the most broken of sinners.
And the darker the story, the better.
If I highlight how bad I was or how bad I sinned, then the story of the grace and forgiveness that God offers is all the more dramatic, is all the more amazing.
Beatty has lately been focused on how evangelical women relate to the Me Too movement. She worries the notion of forgiveness is incomplete when a man, a church leader for example, confesses to sexual misconduct with a woman only to have the story end there.
In these cases, you have a very vertical understanding of forgiveness. So forgiveness is something that happens between the perpetrator and God, but we lack a horizontal understanding of forgiveness. There really has to be a reckoning with the wrong done to this woman.
A sexual sin might actually be a sexual crime. The question of forgiveness versus accountability, and maybe a declining trust in the church, are hot topics in evangelical meetings like one held last week in Washington. Pastor Darrell Crouch from Green Hill Church in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, sees an important lesson for church leaders facing questions about sexual misconduct.
I think everyone who has offended others has to recognize that while God may forgive us and our friends and church may forgive us, there may be a trust gap that is going to be hard to overcome.
It's about violation. It's about power and control.
Kelly Rosati, a vice president at the Focus on the Family organization, says her evangelical culture holds to a biblical ethic regarding men, women, and sexuality. Leadership positions are generally reserved for men. But she wants to keep that ethic separate from what she sees in cases like that of Pastor Andy Savage, who largely escaped church and legal punishment for his misconduct.
I think what you saw in that incident was a conflating of those two issues and a failure to understand that what one person might describe as a sexual incident really is about those other things, the power and the abuse and the violation.
The growing awareness of that reality, Rosati thinks, will soon, in her words, be shaking the ground in the evangelical world. Tom Gelton, NPR News.
It's All Things Considered on WNYC. Coming up, an Alabama reporter says he has discovered what might be the last American slave ship.
I saw this big sort of dinosaur backbone almost arcing up out of the mud along the shoreline. It was just breathtaking.
More on the mystery behind a ship used to illegally bring African captives to the U.S. in 1860. That's coming up after news headlines here on WNYC. 35 degrees right now. We'll see some more clouds moving in this evening. It's going to get pretty cold as well, getting down to a low around 23 degrees. WNYC at 5:30.
On the next Brian Lehrer Show, Andy Byford, the new head of New York City Transit. He vows to fix bus service, not just the subways, with ridership dropping because the buses are so slow, because the streets are so crowded. He's promising to fix Access-a-Ride and take on other accessibility issues, too. Andy Byford will be here for an interview and take your calls. Also, this week's fast-moving developments in the Russia investigation. The Brian Lehrer Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by Your Part-Time Controller, helping nonprofit organizations with all of their accounting and financial reporting needs. Your Part-Time Controller, the nonprofit accounting specialists. More at yourparttimecontroller.com.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Dwayne Brown. The former USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University doctor who admitted to abusing female patients in his care was sentenced today to up to 175 years in prison. Kate Wells of Michigan Radio says the case was prompted by one woman who came forward and initially wasn't believed.
The main prosecutor on this case, Angela Povolitis, did get emotional. She's been working on this case for more than a year now. She talked about how people need to remember that at the beginning of this case, it was just one brave woman, Rachel Denhollander, in 2016, who came forward, and that at that point, people didn't believe her. They ridiculed her for a year and a half. She's been putting up with authorities saying even that she was in this for the money or the fame. So to be at this point, it has taken 150 plus women and girls to actually get their voices heard after 20 years of abuse.
Kate Wells reporting Nassar had already been sentenced to 60 years in prison on separate federal child pornography charges. The Trump administration says it will release a framework for fixing the nation's immigration system next week. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the news caught top Republican lawmakers by surprise.
White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders says the framework is the product of dozens of meetings with both Republican and Democratic lawmakers and represents a compromise she says both parties can support. It includes provisions to secure the border, limits the number of family members current residents can sponsor, and provides a permanent fix for undocumented immigrants who are brought to the country as children.
After decades of inaction by Congress, it's time we work together to solve this issue once and for all.
GOP lawmakers at the center of the immigration debate were not given a heads up about the framework, due out on Monday. But Sanders says the White House hopes the Senate will take it up. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
You are listening to NPR News.
This is WNYC in New York. I'm David First. The judge presiding over the federal corruption trial of Senator Bob Menendez has dismissed 7 counts in the case against the New Jersey Democrat. That leaves several other counts of conspiracy, bribery, and wire fraud for the Justice Department's retrial of the senator expected later this year. The dismissed counts all dealt with alleged bribery involving political donations to Menendez by his longtime friend, Florida eye doctor Solomon Melgen. The judge says that the government failed to demonstrate in the 7 counts that there was an explicit quid pro quo. Judge William Walls also announced in a letter to lawyers that he would recuse himself from any future proceedings. In a statement, Menendez's attorney and the judges said that the judge's decision rejects large parts of the case against the senator, and he hopes the government will reconsider the retrial. One of Governor Andrew Cuomo's pet projects, modernizing subway stations with new signs, lighting, and constructions, is on hold today after complaints by the city. WNYC's Stephen Nesson reports.
2 years ago, the governor announced a plan to spruce up 33 subway stations. 3 in Brooklyn are already done, and 2 in Astoria are underway. But the mayor's representatives complained about the billion-dollar program at the MTA's board meeting Wednesday. Transportation Commissioner Polly Trottenberg, who sits on the board, said the program doesn't make the stations more accessible or ease overcrowding.
I think we all agree, let's spend it in the way that gets the most bang for the buck.
She has her own list of 25 stations to be upgraded first. The board tabled a vote on a contract for the next 8 stations, pending a review.
New York City is far from the only city to sue pharmaceutical companies for their role in the opioid crisis, but its lawsuit likely puts even more pressure on the embattled drug manufacturers to settle. Ed Silverman covers the pharmaceutical industry for Stat News.
The New York suit is high profile. It's the biggest city. They asked for a big fat number. That's all part of the posturing.
The lawsuit announced yesterday calls for $500 million to cover the city's costs of responding to the crisis. All 10 drug companies named in the lawsuit deny that they acted improperly. Quick look at the weather. 35 degrees now. We'll hit a low of 23 overnight tonight. Sunny tomorrow with a high just around 32 degrees. It's going to be cold again tomorrow night, and then a warming trend. It will be up to 43 degrees Friday, 49 degrees on Saturday, and all the way up to 52 on Sunday, although we could be seeing some rain at that time. It's 5:35.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Stars, presenting the original series Counterpart, a conspiracy thriller starring J.K. Simmons. Counterpart, Sundays at 8 p.m. on Stars and on the Stars app. And the Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide to address inequality in all its forms. Learn more at fordfoundation.org.
NPR News, it's All Things Considered. I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Elsa Chang. In western Kentucky, people in Marshall County are still in shock one day after a high school shooting killed 2 students and injured 16 others. A 15-year-old male student remains in custody. Taylor Inman of member station WKMS talks to community members who continue to struggle with this moment.
At a vigil this afternoon at First Baptist Church in Murray, Kentucky, people turned out to pray.
So Lord Jesus, we come to you right now.
Vigils like this one are happening across the region. Resident Janine Saylor attended the gathering. She says even though her son didn't attend the school where the shootings happened, he's lost his sense of security.
As a mom, I've got a child that is about to turn 18. He's a Boy Scout. And my big old boy looked at me this morning and said, I'm afraid to go to school. But if there's a copycat, just very burdened for the innocence lost for our children.
A few miles away, the mood was somber this morning at Hutchins Diner in Benton, just down the road from the high school. Jonathan Smith had tears in his eyes as he reflected on yesterday's events. He's a firefighter and was among the first on the scene.
Is it going to happen again? Quite possibly. That seems to be the norm that's happening in today's society. Can we prevent it?
Marshall County High School was closed today and the streets are still blocked off. Superintendent Trent Lovett told reporters they're still wrestling with how to help students.
We've had some recommendations about when to start school back, and I know there's been some questions about that. From across the nation, we've been listening to some advice, and they think we need to get back to normalcy as soon as possible.
The high school will remain closed for the time being, but elementary and middle school students return to class tomorrow, along with their parents if they want them there. For NPR News, I'm Taylor Inman in Benton, Kentucky.
Yesterday's shooting was not the first to happen on school property in 2018. It was the 11th.
And it was the 3rd this week. 2 other incidents happened on Monday. The first at a high school in Italy, Texas. A 15-year-old girl was shot by another student.
A firefighter who came to the victim's aid here told me tonight she just kept repeating, "Don't let me die."
She's still recovering.
Later that same afternoon, another shooting in the parking lot of a New Orleans charter school. One student was slightly injured.
On January 20th, a student was shot on the campus of Wake Forest University. He died.
January 15th, Marshall, Texas. A bullet was fired into a college dorm room. 3 students were inside. No one was hurt.
And January 10th, 3 shootings in 3 states. First, a suicide at Coronado Elementary School in Arizona.
The school called to report an active shooter around 9 in the morning. When deputies arrived, they found a 14-year-old boy shot dead inside a bathroom.
And at Grayson College in Texas, a student fired a gun in a classroom by accident. No one was hit.
Then that evening in California,
breaking news, shots fired on the campus of Cal State San Bernardino.
1 bullet struck a building, but no one was injured.
It keeps going. January 9th, a man shot a pellet gun at a school bus full of children in Iowa, shattering a window. No one was injured.
And January 4th, 2 shots fired into a Seattle high school during classes. Again, no one was injured.
That same day, in Michigan, a man committed suicide, shot himself in the parking lot of an empty elementary school.
11 shootings, all involving schools, and we are just 24 days into 2018.
Back in the year 1860, slavery was still legal here in the U.S., but importing slaves from overseas had been outlawed for more than 50 years. So, when one southern plantation owner set out in 1860 to buy a ship and smuggle 110 captives from West Africa to Alabama, he tried to cover his tracks. After the captives were brought ashore, the ship was burned, the evidence destroyed, and it sank deep into mud in the Delta, north of Mobile. The ship was called the Clotilda. Ever since, people have tried to find it. Now, a local Alabama reporter believes he may have succeeded. Ben Rains writes for AL.com. He joins me now to tell us how he discovered what might be the last American slave ship. Ben Rains, welcome.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here.
Tell me about that moment. You were out on the water and you saw the remnants of this old wooden schooner just poking out of the mud?
Right. It was an incredibly low tide associated with the super cold weather y'all had in the north with the bomb cyclone. And so I had waited for these low tides to go hunting for the ship. And that moment when I saw it, it was surreal in that I've been by that exact spot many, many times. I've actually fished along that shoreline. And you can't see the ship normally because it's underwater even at low tide. And so here with the tides, more than 2 feet lower than normal, I saw this big sort of dinosaur backbone almost arcing up out of the mud along the shoreline. As I eased closer, it just came into sharper and sharper focus. You could see the bow, you could see the ribs along the side, you could see the entire starboard side of the ship, and this thing is over 100 feet long. You could see the stem, which is on the front of a ship, those big beams of wood that come up where they would affix the big statue of a lady. Those big timbers were there, and they were unmistakable.
And did your heart stop thinking, oh man, have I actually found this thing?
It did. It was actually breathtaking, and I thought this might be it.
What makes you sure this is the Clotilda?
Well, first, I'm not sure. I have a really good hunch, and that was built on a lot of circumstantial evidence. So I began the process of looking for it months ago, and I did that. I was searching the historical record, reading old newspapers, reading actually the captain's account of the trip, every little historical detail I could get, and then I started calling some of the old-timers I know. And one of them in particular, whose family has owned property in the Delta for more than 100 years, told me, I said, do you know where it is? And he said, I think I might. And he told me a very precise location. And so I went to that location where I found a burned ship from the 1800s. And of course, the Clotilda was burned. I could tell the ship was old immediately looking at it. And the ship was right where the captain said he burned it. So, right there, I had 3 pretty good pieces of evidence.
What did happen to the people who came over on the Clotilda? We said there were 110 of them.
Right.
They arrived in Alabama in 1860. We know that. We know they were freed 5 years later with the Civil War ending. Where'd they go?
When the war ended, they all tried to come together. They actually asked Timothy Mayer, the plantation owner, if he would pay to send them home. He refused. They asked the U.S. government. The U.S. government also refused because they weren't registered as slaves, so they couldn't even qualify for the proverbial 40 acres and a mule.
So they're stuck in Alabama. What did they do?
So they worked and made some money and actually bought a parcel of land from the plantation owner, and they created a community and called it Africatown. And they lived there. They spoke their native tongue. They farmed in their traditional methods. They made a church, and actually the community is still there. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And a lot of the descendants of the original slaves are still there.
Still there. And when they learned that maybe the Clotilda had been found, what did they say about what it would mean to them and to their families?
It's been a very profound experience. I have communicated with a number of them. I'm still getting emails from them, and they talk about, closure, and a lot of them are very excited. There actually has, in different times in history, partly by the plantation owner, there were efforts to pretend it never happened. So finding the ship and being able to tie it to their experience is a very powerful thing, and could go a long way toward, healing some of those old wounds, I think.
Ben Rains, he's a reporter for AL.com, and he was telling us there about the mystery of the Clotilda, which he maybe just solved. Ben Rains, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having
me. You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News. Marijuana is illegal in Wyoming, But that's not the case for its neighbor to the south, Colorado. Since Colorado legalized recreational pot in 2014, police in Wyoming have been dealing with an influx of marijuana in all kinds of forms. As Wyoming Public Radio's Bob Beck reports, that has complicated matters in the legislature there.
Wyoming's drug laws don't take into account popular edible and drinkable forms of marijuana. Wyoming makes 3 ounces of leafy marijuana a felony. But when lawmakers tried to make 3 ounces of edible marijuana a felony, there was outrage. State Representative Charles Pelkey.
We can talk about the minutiae of this topic, but the fundamental problem is whether or not you want to charge someone as a felon for bringing a 16-ounce THC-laden drink back into the state of Wyoming.
For those of you wondering, tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is responsible for marijuana's psychological effects. It's what gives you a high. The problem is that some forms of edible marijuana have a lot of THC and some don't. All forms of edible marijuana have other ingredients such as butter, oil, and sugar. Maka Kaladi is the Director of Sales and Marketing for Organic Alternatives, which is a place where you can purchase pot in Fort Collins, Colorado. In some ways, it looks like a candy store with chocolate and gummy bears laced with THC. There's also a wide variety of traditional forms of cannabis. He says 3 ounces of pot that you smoke is a lot.
It would absolutely take me at least 3 months, if not 6 months, to finish 3 ounces of cannabis.
Which is why it's a felony in Wyoming, because it's assumed that much marijuana will be sold. But it wouldn't take Hawaii 6 months to finish a pot brownie. The Wyoming legislature will consider 2 bills this session, and neither takes it easy on edibles. One would make 3 ounces of edible marijuana and 36 ounces of liquid marijuana a felony, while the other bill would make 3 ounces a felony, but lessen penalties for first and second offenders. The tough stance is because law enforcement sees dangers with edibles. John Nepper of the Wyoming Attorney General's office says people often eat more than the recommended serving.
One of the things that the edible marijuana industry has taught us is that if you want to sell a psychoactive substance, a really effective way is to bundle it with chocolate, because that's something people like.
Laramie defense attorney Cole Sherrard fears countless felony charges over small amounts of marijuana. Wyoming State Crime Lab says it can't measure for THC, and THC levels on labels is hearsay and inadmissible in court. But Sherrard says they need to figure it out.
I think there's enough literature and research out there where you can at least get some idea of how much are in these edible products and try to compare those to our current statutes and try to come up with something a little more fair.
Representative Pelkey says the legislature has wasted too much time on the issue and thinks they should move to decriminalize Wyoming's marijuana laws.
I haven't spent this much time listening to people pointlessly talking about weed since I was in high school.
The full legislature will once again consider the issue next month. For NPR News, I'm Bob Beck in Laramie.
It's All Things Considered on WNYC. Coming up next, just in time for dinner, we'll hear about the new cookbook, Hawker Fare, Stories and Recipes from a Refugee Chef's Isan, Thai, and Lao Roots. And coming up next hour, all this week, we're looking at the consequences of President Trump's restrictive immigration policies through the experiences of one refugee couple, Andre and Lizette. Tonight, we'll hear how Andre is carving out a life in New Jersey while waiting for Lizette to join him. The series Unsettled continues next hour here on WNYC.
For generations, the United States has welcomed
WNYC supporters include Focus Features presenting Darkest Hour, starring Gary Oldman as Prime Minister Winston Churchill as Germany closes in on Britain in World War II, now playing in theaters everywhere. Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport, located 20 minutes to downtown and the beach, offering corporate aviation, air charter flight training, and U.S. Customs. More at flyfxe.com.
Quick look at the weather. It's going to be a little bit cold tonight. Right now, 36 degrees. We're going to have some more clouds moving in, and we'll hit a low around 23 tonight. Tomorrow, sunny skies expected, but we're just going to be getting up to a high around the freezing mark. Tomorrow night, mostly clear with a low of 24. And then over the next several days, things do start to get warmer once again. 43 degrees on Friday, up to 49 on Sunday, 49 on Saturday, 52 degrees on Sunday. But a really good chance for that we're going to be seeing some rain on Sunday. WNYC right now, it's 5:50.
It's All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Elsa Chang.
And I'm Mary Louise Kelly. When James Seaboot set out to write his new cookbook titled Hawker Fare, he sampled a recipe that I'm going to go out on a limb and guess is not on your dinner table tonight: fire ant salad.
There's like ants crawling in and out of it. And like, put in your mouth chew real fast.
Welcome to Lao food from Laos, Southeast Asia. Laos shares a border with Thailand, and Lao cooking is a cousin to Thai, except it's the distant cousin you've maybe never met. Seaboot says that's kind of the point of his cookbook, to introduce us.
The food that we know as Thai food, it's sweeter. You know, it's like, I call it the Coca-Cola culture. We all love soda, candy, you know, things that are sweet.
But before we get to his food philosophy, let's go back to the beginning of